I used to think HOA problems were just internet jokes. Complaints about mailbox colors and trash cans sticking out an inch too far, annoying but harmless. Until the morning I walked down into my garage in my quiet suburban California neighborhood and found a different SUV parked inside my own locked garage. Not mine, not invited, not asked. Someone had physically entered my garage and parked inside like they owned the space. And the moment I realized, it was Karen from the HOA, the woman who treated this neighborhood like she was a small-scale dictator with architectural power. The woman who believed every inch of this community existed under her control. Something in me changed. There wasn't yelling. There wasn't shock. It was a quiet pressure forming inside my chest, calm and deliberate. I looked at that SUV and I didn't say a single word out loud. I walked back to the manual lock bar on the interior of my garage. I pushed it down. I locked her inside my own property, and I went back into the house without a single raised heartbeat. Within 2 hours, I booked myself a week-long trip up the California coast. I packed a bag. I left no courtesy note. I left no message. I turned off my internal garage cameras, and I drove away from my home with her car still trapped inside. That was the moment this stopped being small petty neighbor irritation. That was the moment this became something darker and slower, and far more dangerous. And when I returned 7 days later, everything in this neighborhood felt different. The HOA board, the neighbors, the police, and Karen herself. And this was only the beginning of how far she would go when she realized she lost control. When I drove back into the neighborhood 1 week later, it did not feel like the same suburb I left. The air felt heavier. The street felt like it was holding its breath. There were cars parked in ways people normally didn't park here. There were 2 unfamiliar sedans, sitting 3 houses down, with people inside who weren't looking at their phones or facing forward like normal neighbors waiting for someone. They were angled toward my house. There was an unmarked Silver County SUV that I had never seen before on this street, and every curtain on the left side of the cul-de-sac seemed slightly shifted like someone had been keeping track of when I would come home. I had only been gone 7 days. But 7 days in neighborhoods like this is a long time when someone like Karen is spinning a narrative before the target returns. Even before I pulled completely into my driveway, I knew she had been telling everyone her version first. I could feel the narrative foundation already poured. She got to shape the moral frame before I even stepped foot back into my house, and that is one of the most dangerous advantages someone like her can have. Because people in clean, well-landscaped communities like this will instantly believe the woman who looks organized and righteous before they even consider the silent man minding his own business. I cut the ignition and sat for 10 seconds with my hands flat on the steering wheel. The garage door remained locked exactly how I left it. The SUV inside was still there. That part actually surprised me. I expected someone to have forced it open by now. Someone had clearly tried, though. The bottom weather strip showed stress. The metal around the manual release hinge had marks. Someone tried to break into my private property while I was gone. And the part that made it worse was I could already predict exactly who would claim the victim role. When I stepped out of my car, 2 people immediately started walking toward me fast. It was Karen and the HOA president, Charles. Charles was the type who acted neutral until someone else did the dirty work, and then he pretended he was trying to manage the situation like a reasonable adult. She told me I violated HOA community trust. She told me I illegally held someone's property hostage. She told me this was criminal false imprisonment of a vehicle. She spoke like a prosecutor, and she tried to force momentum into her accusation as if speed itself would become truth if she kept talking fast enough. I didn't react. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I said something very simple and very private in volume, but very clear. I told her I never gave anyone permission to enter my garage, and anything that happened after that was a chain reaction caused by her trespassing. One sentence, calm, unemotional. Her eyes flinched, like she wasn't expecting no fear. She expected panic. She expected defensiveness. She expected embarrassment. But angry people lose power when the person they intend to control shows none of the emotions that give them leverage. Charles shifted his stance because he realized this might not be as simple as Karen already framed it. And when I walked toward my front door and ignored both of them standing there waiting for more of a back and forth argument, Karen raised her voice behind me loud enough for neighbors to hear. She said she had already contacted law enforcement, and she said there would be consequences. She was now threatening legal intervention in public, where optics mattered, where eavesdropping mattered, where she could try to convert the entire block into witnesses before facts were established. I walked inside my house without responding to her, and when the door closed behind me, that quiet pressure inside my chest tightened again, controlled, focused, intentional, not rage, not chaos, not impulsive retaliation. This was going to require patience, precision, and something far slower than anything she ever expected, from someone who she believed was just passive and easy to push around. The garage was silent. Her SUV sat inside it like a held breath. In that moment, I realized something important. She had committed the first crime, but she was already preparing to weaponize the second one. Her accusation was not about truth. It was about winning the story. It was about turning everyone else into a jury before the police even arrived. And I understood right then that this was going to grow in ways she never imagined. This was not going to be a short, petty neighbor disagreement. This was going to be a collision between people who refused to give up control, and I was not going to be the one who broke first. The first sheriff deputy showed up 40 minutes later. Not lights, not siren. Quiet pull-up. Standard county cruiser. Calm posture. He approached the house, not like this was an emergency, but like this was a civil neighbor dispute he had been dragged into. The way he knocked told me he already assumed this was more HOA drama than actual crime. I opened the door, and I could already see on his face that Karen had told her version first. The tone he used was polite, but slightly suspicious in that way cops speak when they feel forced to give weight to someone hysterical, because they don't know yet what they are actually stepping into. He said there was a report of a vehicle being unlawfully detained. He said the HOA president had also contacted them separately, and he said someone inside the community claimed there might be a safety concern. I could see Karen 3 houses down pretending not to watch. She stood too still. She held her phone in her hand, not to record, but to be ready to call someone the instant she needed a new escalation. This type of person does not rely on truth. They rely on momentum. Their power is narrative inertia. If they speak first and louder, they think the world will bend to the direction of their voice. She was waiting for me to panic so she could escalate into fragile victimhood in front of law enforcement. I walked the deputy into the house calm and deliberate and showed him the garage door still locked from inside. I told him exactly what happened in the same restrained, neutral tone I had been holding since the moment I found her car in my garage. I told him I left town for 7 days. I told him I never gave anyone permission to enter my locked garage. I told him I returned and found someone else had been driving an SUV that was not theirs parked in my private space. I told him I left it there because I wanted law enforcement to see the situation before I touched anything. I did not explain emotional reasoning. I did not argue fairness. I made it factual, clean, linear, evidence-based. He paused longer than I expected. He stared at the vehicle like he was trying to piece backward how this story began. Then he asked the most important question Karen never expected. How did they get inside your garage to begin with? His eyes shifted to the exterior frame. He noticed the tamper marks. He noticed the weather-stripping stress. His posture changed. His eyebrows moved slightly, like he had found the first thread that contradicted the narrative he was preloaded with when he arrived. Karen saw the deputy inside through the tiny garage inset window and walked up fast toward the door. She started speaking through the exterior like she was directing a courtroom. She tried to talk over what was happening, even though she had no idea what was being said. That is when the deputy asked her a simple question through the cracked door. Did you enter his garage without permission? She didn't say yes or no. She launched into a justification rant about community trust and architectural committee rights and the rule book and temporary space usage guidelines. She tried to drown the clarity of the question with volume and bureaucratic jargon. That was the first time the deputy gave her a cold, direct stop signal tone. He told her to answer yes or no. She knew she was cornered. She knew she had already been caught in the moment she tried to rationalize instead of answer. She said she had been acting on behalf of the HOA and that I had been non-cooperative historically, which was a lie. And that small sentence told me she had already decided she was going to rewrite history to justify her own intrusion. The deputy stepped back inside with me and shut the door behind him, leaving her outside the garage. That separation told me the power dynamic was shifting. He asked if I wanted to unlock it now with law enforcement present. I nodded. I opened it slowly. Karen stood there, frozen, like she expected something else to happen, like she thought opening that door would result in her winning a moral victory by default. But instead, the deputy told her this was a potential trespass situation, and possibly breaking and entering. His tone went flat and procedural. That is when the panic flashed across her face. It was small, but it was real, and that moment told me she was more afraid of losing her authority than she was of being wrong. Everything changed right then, because she realized this wasn't a neighbor she could intimidate. This was someone she could not manipulate into folding first. And she realized she was now the one who stepped into a legal corner she didn't plan for. That was not the climax. That was not even the major conflict. That was just the first fracture. And fractures like that never stay small in neighborhoods like this. 2 days passed after that deputy left, and the tension in this entire neighborhood moved into a different frequency. Karen stopped pretending she was friendly or neutral in public. She stopped waving that fake polite suburban mask she used to manipulate people with. She became quiet, driven, calculating. And silence from a person like her is always more dangerous than the noise. Because silence means she was building the next stage in private. Silence meant she was gathering every possible angle she could weaponize. Silence meant she was preparing the kind of retaliation that did not come loud or obvious. The kind that came through structure and politics and paperwork, and intimidation disguised as official procedure. On the third morning, I woke up and found an official violation slip taped to my front door. It was professionally printed. It listed 4 separate HOA code violations that were not real. One was claiming I had stored hazardous materials improperly. Another claimed I had been using my garage as a non-permitted commercial workshop. One line claimed neighbors had complained about loud mechanical operations and suspicious activity. The last one claimed I had been intentionally obstructing community cohesion. That last phrase felt like she wrote it herself. It felt like she believed she had jurisdiction to define morality inside this block. I stood in my kitchen staring at that paper, while the coffee maker hissed like background static. I realized this was not about the SUV anymore. This was about punishment. This was about teaching me a lesson for not backing down. This was about her regaining control after being exposed by law enforcement. And the most disturbing part was that she was using the HOA system itself as a weapon. She was using bureaucracy as a blade. I filed a dispute letter. I documented everything. I printed photos of the tamper marks. I printed screenshots of time-stamped camera logs. I wrote a clear factual rebuttal with no emotional language. I submitted it formally. I knew she would not expect me to fight it with calm documented evidence. She expected rage. She expected chaos. She expected reactive behavior she could point to and say, look, he's unstable, he's the problem, he's the risk. She built entire psychological strategies based on provoking people until they became the villain. So I took that away from her. That night, I heard her SUV engine start outside. I heard the slow roll idle down the street. She didn't drive normally anymore, that she was not going away, that she was taking back narrative ground inch by inch, that she was going to find the next angle to break me through procedural pressure. I started noticing neighbors avoiding eye contact. Conversations that used to happen casually on sidewalks suddenly stopped when I approached. Two people I used to joke with about their dogs suddenly changed direction when they saw me walking. It was fear. Karen had been seeding poison for months before this day even happened. She had been building the version of me she needed them to believe long before she ever stepped foot inside my garage. Now she was feeding them the escalation, like she was revealing the truth of a monster they always suspected was there. Late that night, I sat in the dark living room with no lights on, just watching the street from inside. The street lights reflected faint orange on the windshield of Karen's passing SUV. She drove by again at almost 1 in the morning. Her silhouette moved barely at all. The way she stared toward my house as she passed made one thing very clear. She was no longer acting like an entitled neighbor. She was acting like someone preparing for a personal war, and I knew at that point the SUV inside my garage was not the center of this story anymore. That was just the trigger. The real story was the power struggle that had been waiting silently under this neighborhood for years. And now that pressure had finally found the surface, and there was no version of this where she would retreat gracefully, she was going to keep escalating until she won, or until someone made sure she could never do this again. 3 more days passed, and I noticed something subtle, but unmistakable. Karen stopped trying to confront me directly. She shifted her strategy sideways. She stopped standing in the open. She stopped raising her voice publicly. She stopped driving by as often. That kind of person doesn't suddenly back down. When someone like her goes quiet, it means she moved into influence warfare behind closed doors. She had access. She had HOA board power. She had email lists. She had private group chats with the other committee members. She had private grievance logs. She had selective memory archives. She had the ability to twist half-truths into legal complaints. She could turn assumptions into documented concerns that sounded official enough to trigger investigations, and she used all of it. I started receiving letters from the HOA insurance carrier requesting clarification on my personal liability coverage. I received a certified envelope from a private legal mediator the board apparently consulted. I received a notification from the county that someone had filed a neighborhood nuisance report against my property. All of it paperwork, all separated. None of it directly from Karen's name. That was strategic. She wanted me confused from multiple sides. She wanted instability. She wanted me reacting emotionally, so she could point at that reaction and turn it into proof I was unfit to be here. I realized she was trying to erase my credibility inside the system before the actual board hearing took place. Because if she could destroy the perception of my reliability first, then evidence wouldn't matter anymore. Once reputation collapses, facts lose weight. That is how these people operate. Not with violent force, but with narrative corrosion. I began documenting everything in a binder, screenshots, dates, copies, times, every passing SUV, every notice, every statement from neighbors that suddenly got awkward and short. I used cold precision because I knew she expected me to be emotional and reckless. Instead, I became still, observational, strategic. And stillness scares people who want you to panic. On the 6th day after I returned home, I saw her walking with 2 HOA board members to the community mailbox unit. She pretended she didn't see me. They pretended they were having a normal, casual conversation. But I saw the way they leaned toward her more than usual. I saw how she spoke slower than she used to, like she was giving them instructions rather than gossip. She wasn't ranting anymore. She was planting seeds, and they were listening to her like she already convinced them something about me before this moment. Later that night, at almost midnight, I heard footsteps near my garage. Not loud, soft, intentional. Like someone was checking something physical without wanting to be detected. When I stepped outside fast and quiet through the side door, they were already gone. Whoever it was moved quickly. They had been standing near the manual lock hinge. Maybe they were photographing it. That same night, I checked my security system backend and noticed 3 attempted remote access login attempts while I was asleep the night before. They all came from within my local ISP region. They weren't random hackers. That was someone nearby, someone trying to get into my private surveillance systems. It became obvious that Karen was not just trying to punish me. She was trying to set up a pretext to get me removed from the community entirely. She wanted full character assassination before the board hearing. She wanted to manufacture a version of reality where every step I took appeared suspicious enough that the HOA could justify removing me permanently. Because that is how people like her survive. They don't compete fairly. They destroy weaknesses before anyone sees possibility of equality. The neighborhood was no longer a place of calm, clean suburban life. It was a psychological battlefield now, and every single subtle detail from this point forward mattered, because she made sure the stakes were no longer small or petty. This was about control, territory, power, and survival of narrative. She crossed into something irreversible, and there was no version of this where I stayed passive anymore. I knew the climax was coming, and she had no idea how prepared I already was. The night before the HOA board hearing, I barely slept at all. Not because I was afraid of the outcome, but because my body felt like it already registered something heavy in the air before my mind consciously caught it. It felt like the air pressure before a storm. It felt like the inside of the neighborhood was winding itself tight. It felt like every single choice that led to this point was converging into one narrow point that nothing could reverse after sunrise. The meeting was held inside the community center multipurpose room, the same room where kids' birthday parties happened, the same room where holiday potluck signups used to be pinned to corkboards. Everything looked normal on the surface, but you could feel the distrust in the air. The board sat behind a folding table like some small judicial tribunal. Karen sat 2 seats from center, like she was already part of the sentencing body, rather than someone who should have been recused because she was directly involved. No one questioned that. That was the nature of power here. Authority is rarely earned. It is usually perceived, and she built perception around herself like armor. Neighbors took chairs on both sides of the room. Some avoided looking at me. Some stared straight at Karen, like they wanted direction on how to react. And then the sheriff deputy from that first day walked in quietly through the side door. The real beginning, the hearing began. Karen spoke first. Her words were sharpened. She claimed psychological disturbance. She claimed community danger. She claimed unpredictable escalation risk. She painted me like a man capable of harming the neighborhood. She gave them a villain they could fear, and fear is always more persuasive than truth. She listed fake violations like she had been rehearsing them in front of a mirror for days. She spoke as if she were morally entitled to every square foot of this HOA. She invoked community safety like a religious doctrine. When they gave me my turn, I didn't argue any emotion. I didn't argue character. I laid out facts. I placed printed photo after printed photo on the table. Tamper marks, time-stamped logs, evidence of entry. I placed copies of the fabricated violation notices next to copies of actual HOA code text disproving them. I placed evidence of attempted remote access into my security system. And then I lifted one more sheet and placed a printed photo from a neighbor's Ring camera that I obtained quietly through someone who had started seeing the truth behind her. It showed Karen outside my garage at midnight that night. She thought she was unseen. The boardroom changed. You could feel the shift in real time. It didn't erupt. It inverted, quiet, slow, heavy. The deputy leaned forward slightly and studied the photo for several seconds. Karen froze. She didn't flinch, she didn't deny, she didn't even breathe for a moment. She simply stared at it like she couldn't believe something slipped outside her control for even 30 seconds in this world. The board requested a 10-minute recess. They went into the small kitchen area behind the divider wall. Karen followed them. They didn't close the partition fully. You could hear fragments. Not full sentences, just fragments, but it was enough. One board member said the words, "This could legally expose all of us." Another said, "I told you she went too far this time." And then The HOA president said, "I don't want any part of liability for this." That was the exact second her power broke. When they returned, they announced the board would be initiating emergency removal of Karen from all committee positions pending legal review. They announced all 4 violation claims against me were null and void. They announced that trespass charges were under investigation. Karen didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She sat perfectly still like a statue. Her eyes did not blink. She stared at the table, like reality stopped functioning the way she needed it to. And when the meeting ended, and people slowly filtered back out into the parking lot, under the artificial LED streetlights that made everything look slightly too sharp and too clean, she walked out last. She never looked at me directly. She walked to her car with a stiff, slow, mechanical stride like she was moving through water. For the first time since this started, she looked small, and I knew then this wasn't over, because people like that don't accept defeat cleanly. They don't disappear. They retreat. They regroup. They wait for the moment. Revenge can mutate into a smaller, hidden method of destruction. But her domination era was broken. Her myth collapsed in a room full of people who had once feared her. The narrative she built for years fell apart in less than an hour. That was the climax. That was the moment everything reversed direction. The next morning, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, not relieved, just quiet in the way a place feels right after a wildfire gets contained. But the smoke still hangs over everything. People started walking differently on the sidewalks. They looked around before stepping outside. They talked in lower tones on their front porches. They weren't afraid of me anymore. They were afraid of what they were part of without knowing it. No one came to Karen's defense anymore. Not even the people who used to treat her like her authority was some kind of shield they could hide behind. That power dissolved the moment her control was publicly removed. Authority is fragile when it existed only because other people believed in it. Once belief breaks, it becomes dust. She tried to pretend she wasn't bothered. She stayed inside her house for almost 2 weeks. Curtains closed every morning. No SUV patrols. No mailbox surveillance. No slow walking attempts to intimidate. She disappeared herself by choice. I knew she wasn't gone. She was just waiting until she believed the attention shifted. The sheriff told me the case was still open. He told me if she contacted me at all, in any direct form, to call immediately. His tone was serious in a way that said he knew her type before this. People like her don't surrender. They try to reinvent their attack angle. The HOA never apologized to me. Most people don't apologize when they got manipulated because they don't want to admit they were easy to influence. But the energy changed. People spoke to me carefully with a new kind of respect that wasn't personal admiration. It was a respect that came from realizing I didn't let myself get destroyed by someone who fed off control. They realized I was not the man Karen tried to script in her version of the story. One late afternoon, I walked past Karen's house on purpose, not to confront her, not to provoke her, just to exist openly without fear on my own street. Through the front window, I saw her sitting at her dining table, staring straight ahead like her entire identity evaporated when her authority was taken away. She didn't look angry. She looked hollow. People who build their identity on control have nothing left when the control collapses. She saw me through the glass. She didn't move. She didn't speak through the window. She didn't open the door. She just looked like she finally understood that her world stopped responding to her voice. Weeks passed. No new notices. No secret complaints. No surveillance. The board quietly replaced her. People slowly began to live normally again, but something in this neighborhood permanently changed. The illusion of perfect suburb peace had been broken. The idea that danger only comes in violent, obvious forms was gone. Everyone learned that the most dangerous kind of enemy isn't the one that attacks openly. It is the one that manipulates perception until everyone believes the wrong person is the threat. When I walk into my garage now, there is nothing remarkable inside it. Just my tools, my bike, storage bins, normal life. But every time I stand there alone, I still feel that cold, quiet pressure in my chest. The same pressure I felt the first moment I saw her SUV parked there without permission. The kind of pressure that tells you exactly when a person has crossed beyond boundary, and that feeling never lies. So when people laugh online about HOA stories, like they're just petty suburban drama, I understand why. They haven't lived through the kind where the villain isn't loud. The villain is subtle, patient, intelligent enough to twist systems like weapons, and willing to invade your life without ever stepping inside your house again. I survived that not because I fought louder than her. I survived because I didn't play on her emotional battlefield. I made her face evidence, truth, reality, something her kind can't outrun. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do to someone who needs to control everything is simply show them they never actually controlled you at all.